Good morning. Uh, Thanks. So does drug matter below the knee is the way I took this talk, because I think it's going to be germane as the next 6 to 12 months play out in regards to data. So why is this a difficult question? I think, unfortunately, the outcomes for above the knee seem pretty simple and dependent upon patency and walking difficulties. It's usually a Claudicant's disease. But the BTK data have been mired in a series of trials based on their endpoints, the heterogeneity of the subjects that have been enrolled, the non-uniform nature of wound care, and the type of patients enrolled. You have a lot of these critical limb patients, quote unquote, which have enrolled Rutherford 3 patients. And so we just don't have any great data, and it's really showing up in the outcomes of many of these trials. So if we just review where we are, probably the original and what you probably know most of is the impact deep data, the primary efficacy with late lumen loss compared with clinically driven TLR with the drug-eluting balloon versus PTA was a wash. They had a late lumen loss that was exactly the same, 0.62 millimeters on both sides, which was non-significant, and the CD-TLR rate was actually no different. When it came to primary safety, there was this big conundrum of a risk of higher outcomes that were poor in the DCB group compared with PTA group. So there was a lot of interest as to why that is, and at least for this type of balloon, which was crystalline Paclitaxel, it tends to embolize, and there's this big issue of distal embolization. Levant, which was not crystalline, did their trial, and they showed some benefit of their device compared to PTA, but when you looked at it kind of more pragmatically, it really didn't show much difference to the PTA group. And when it went to panel, they voted 2-15 with one abstention to not approve the device. So that doesn't seem to work. Well, what about stenting? Boston's done a great job. I give Jeff Mervis a ton of credit for actually bringing Boston back from the brink of death. And they had victories in every trial. And then they had Saval. And Saval was a complete failure. And the problem with Saval is that long-length stents in your tibials are probably not useful, right? I mean, I think we'd all agree with that. And I think if you didn't know Saval, you should look back at Excel, which was the Viva 1 trial, which was with the old expert stent. And that proved that long stents in your tibials, tibials don't like them. So it's like putting, your LAD on most people is about 13 to 14 centimeters, and putting 10 centimeters of stent in there. It's probably not terribly useful. Well, what about best CLI? So yeah, this is a great trial. Everybody should read it. New England Journal. Alec Farber was the lead author, but some really good data sets. It took them 5 years to enroll this study. Only 18% were non-surgeons. They had no what do they call a interventional monitoring group to look at the people who did the endovascular therapy. There was a large proportion of crossovers. Whoops, let's see if I can get this to move. In the endo group that's never been defined. Ken Rosenfield, who was one of the PIs, is really focused on that, and we want to try to understand that better. And the primary outcomes on the surgical side were really major outcomes, not what you're seeing today from Albuquerque. That was not considered a failure of the surgical group. That's actually a secondary endpoint, which I find a complete failure of best CLI. What about Basel 2? Well, it took them 10 years to enroll Basel. And both Basel and BEST didn't have, better English, didn't have a lot of DCB below the knee. So again, does angioplasty trump everything else? All the trials would suggest yes. And so, however, their primary endpoint was revision of the graft or stenosis, which tended to make now endo first as a very useful thing for Basel 2. Lastly, Medi just published in the New England Journal this past year limb flow. This is for the no option patient, again, for people who have no other endovascular option. And in limb flow, it's a graft to the vein, which shows benefit. Remember, it's a 1 in 4 hit rate that is success, probably a 1 in 3 hit rate of long-term benefit of wound healing. But again, this does not require or has not required drug. But I would tell you that their primary assisted patency and secondary patencies are listed here, really abysmal outcomes when it comes to primary successes. So understand that if you're going to start going down this road, you got to do it and do it well with the understanding, and your patient has to understand that it may not be a long-term success. So are these patients the same, I guess, is ultimately the question. You have kind of the same infrapopliteal occlusion, both of which have great toe ulceration, so the targets are pretty similar, and you get the same outcome in regards to PTA. But they don't behave the same in many cases when you work on the same vessel. And I think that's critical to these long-term trials. So what's in the future? I think it's a good time to be alive, so to speak, as an interventionalist. You have, again, we've talked about Serenator and the Cagent device, Magic Touch with Concept, iVascular, Acitex out there. Impact Deep is now doing its, what was that? Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo, that old movie. I think they're kind of doing a redux of Impact Deep. You have the Solution with Meta-Alliance. Orchestra's already out there. And so I think that this year you're going to have a series of presentations, both at TCT and at Viva, on drug technology below the knee. And it may not just be the drug technology on balloon, but it, again, is going to be a bioresorbable. I'm on the steering committee with Sahel in the group for Life BTK, who's going to be presenting. R3 is going to be presenting. There's a lot of groups that are now looking at alternative methods for below the knee drug coatings. So when it comes to the conclusion, the BTK trials are the in thing when it comes to endovascular therapy. Unfortunately, not one group, whether it's industry or society, and particularly the FDA, have generalized a single population or an outcome measure. When you read these trials, please don't just read the abstract, but really delve into the data, because it really will show you where they're failing. Unfortunately, the difficulties with these patients, their wounds, and endpoints have allowed, again, not one trial to date to be successful and acceptable when it comes to either POBA, which has been our default, versus alternative. Yeah, I see a ton of atherectomy there, but you show me one trial that shows benefit to an outcome of amputation-free survival, which is the ultimate metric of the lowest metric, lowest bar to cross, and you can't show me that. So again, you understand the data. You have to look at it fairly pragmatically. I think there's some signals that Limus and Paclitaxel, or injections, which we didn't have a chance to show here, may be useful. But again, we got to look at the data and the endpoints on these trials. I think the patient needs to be very specific. I think we need to start with the barest bones patient. If it's a great hallux lesion, then everybody has to have the predicate device in the AT and not treat. Or if you're going to treat other lesions, then they go into a registry part of it. But you need to be focused on one thing and one thing to test. And I think that's unfortunately not going to be the case. Sometimes the targets are not well visualized, as we've seen before, and the targets must be for the specific anatomy treated. So if you go in there with a great hallux lesion and you're not treating the AT, you shouldn't, in the spirit of the trial, enroll that patient. And that has to be disclosed when they tell you the outcomes of their trials. And really, the ethical question in my book is, as we know, when you have critical limb, would it be ethical to enroll a patient in the spirit of a trial for an AT lesion and not treat two other lesions that are in the PT or perineal for critical limb? And if that's the case and you cannot ethically do that, then they shouldn't be in the trial, because treating those other lesions tends to cloud the outcomes of your trial design. Thank you.